Why did they get in the media? Why didn't mainstream Muslim organizations get in the media? I argue in my book that it's because of the emotional valence of their message. These were, visceral, fearful, and angry condemnations of Muslims and Muslim Americans in particular that really alerted a public that had very little idea, again, what Islam was, who Muslims were. A majority of Americans had not met a Muslim, and a majority of Americans were unable to identify the Quran as the holy book of Islam or Allah as the deity associated with Islam. And so America's imagination about Islam was very fertile. There was a real opportunity to define what was going on. And as is so often the case with the media, the loudest voice gets most of the attention. Now, the story might have ended there had, like the proverbial boy who cries wolf, in the absence of another major terror attack, we might have seen these type of emotional appeals disappear. And instead, we saw something very different. Though I showed you that these groups represented a minority of all voices talking about Islam, it appeared as if they were a majority. And that is because of the media distortion of this family of organizations. So the majority view wasn't getting out. The minority view was being misperceived as a majority view. Now, this had a variety of consequences, but one of the most important, I argue, was for Muslim American organizations themselves. And so this rise, this surge of anti-Muslim sentiment in the media, I argue in my book, created what I call a riptide, a reaction among mainstream Muslim organizations that served to further increase the profile of anti-Muslim organizations. This chart describes what types of messages mainstream Muslim groups like the Council on American-Islamic Relations, like the Muslim Public Affairs Council, were making in their messages. Now, you may not be able to read this. On the top, this large line, this is the number of press releases per day, and this is the period from 2001 to 2003. It was very common for organizations to dispatch press releases that condemned anti-Muslim sentiment. These were things like hate crimes against Muslims, controversies about whether, for example, imams should be allowed to pray at an airport, and so on and so forth. And many, many organizations were understandably very critical of these types of issues. This lower line here shows all of the press releases that were picked up by the media that condemned anti-Muslim sentiment. Okay, so you can see the majority of their voice in the media was condemning anti-Muslim sentiment. And this tinier line here describes the number of press releases that condemned terrorism. So not anti-Muslim sentiment, but terrorism. Groups like Al-Qaeda, which was then the foremost terrorist organization, of course. And this tiny sliver, this tiny black sliver here, describes the number of press releases by mainstream Muslim organizations that received any media coverage. And so if you can imagine for a moment that you're an American with very little information about Islam, and you're confronted by a media that showed you a variety of very fearful and compelling messages that suggest Islam is in fact a dangerous religion, combined with an apparent absence of condemnation on the part of Muslim Americans themselves, and instead a group of people, Muslim Americans, who appeared more concerned about dispatching and discarding anti-Muslim sentiment than they were about condemning terrorism. And so I'll show you in a moment how this kind of helped this anti-Muslim narrative coalesce. Anti-Muslim organizations were able to accuse mainstream Muslim organizations of tacitly condoning terrorism because they never publicly, their message was not getting out, unequivocally condemning terrorism by groups like Al-Qaeda. And at the same time, it lent credence to the idea that these groups were actually hiding behind a veil of political correctness. That is, that they were more concerned about criticizing anti-Muslim sentiment than they were about criticizing terrorism itself. Now, at the time, Muslim American leaders were enmeshed in very vexing debates about whether and how terrorism should be condemned. There was a very real concern that by condemning terrorism, you would somehow legitimate the idea that Islam has anything to do with terrorism. And so many organizations, such as the Council on American-Islamic Relations, spent much more of their time, as this graph shows, condemning anti-Muslim sentiment rather than condemning terrorism. I'll come back to that theme a little later. And so here the analogy again is a riptide. So the more that mainstream Muslim American groups condemn anti-Muslim rhetoric, the further they get pulled out to sea, until we actually see a sea change of public discourse around Islam. That is, that attacking fire with fire, and that's, by the way, why so many of the anti-Muslim, so many of the condemnations of anti-Muslim sentiment got media attention because they were also very emotionally charged. People were extremely angry at people like Daniel Pipes, and that, of course, feeds the media frenzy. The media sees the back and forth of emotions and gravitates towards that. Meanwhile, condemnations of terrorism were much more intellectual and dispassionate. They liked to invoke geopolitics and kind of more intellectual reasoning, but lacked the tangible emotion that the media gravitates towards. And so I argue in the book that's one reason they didn't get much media attention. Yet again, these condemnations of anti-Muslim sentiment fed the media fire, increased the profile of anti-Muslim organizations, and enabled them to achieve even more standing within the mass media. So as you can see, this is the first graph I showed you, which is at the after 9/11 environment. Here are organizations that produce anti-Muslim messages. Here's the vast majority of groups who are producing pro or moderately pro-Muslim messages. And between 2001 and 2003, and 2004 and 2006, you can see that the number of organizations producing anti-Muslim messages more than doubled. The color of these circles, by the way, describes the emotional valence of their message. It's a little bit hard to see on this screen. But you can see again that the emotional power down here of anti-Muslim groups was increasing as they grew in size. Okay, but at this point they still represent a minority of all groups battling or struggling to shape American public discourse about Islam. How did they become mainstream? How did we get to the point where they could raise $245 million and compel major political figures to express such vehemently anti-Muslim views? Well, here's one more year of data. So here's the plagiarism detection analysis for 2001 to 2003, 2004 to 2006, 2007 to 2008. And as you can see on the right side of the graph here, the number of organizations that are expressing an anti-Muslim narrative increases threefold. These ties, these kind of arcs between these organizations, describe organizations that share a board member. And so you can see that not only did they grow in size, but they also forged allegiances to powerful organizations outside of the field, such as the Republican Jewish Coalition, other groups who would enable them to solidify their stature within the public sphere, and more importantly, would enable them to make weak ties to financiers, other political connections that would solidify their stature. So this graph describes several of the largest anti-Muslim organizations in the country at the time, and shows that their donations to contributions in US dollars here over this period from 2001 to 2011 again grew exponentially, even at the height of the financial crisis in 2008. And I argue in the book that the increased media profile of these organizations gave them the standing necessary to become visible, to become an organization that could be essentially donated to. And with this money, they began to further consolidate their capacity to define Islam within the American public sphere. So one of the ways they did this, I argue in the book, is to invent experts. Now, the very idea of a terrorism expert is a bit of an oxymoron. Terrorism is, by definition, arbitrary and indiscriminate. And of course, collecting data on terrorism is extremely difficult. And so even among academics, there's very little consensus about how and why terrorism happens. But there is an industry, a very well-funded industry of people who call themselves terrorism experts, many of whom have very little credentials to call themselves such.